Hi, this is Paul, and some of you will recognize this guy. Part of the problem with these stage names and YouTube names is I always remember the stage name better than the real name. So, Guy, I thought it's so funny because sometimes some of the conversations that I think are the most important, the they don't necessarily pan out in terms of the algorithm or the analytics, but I really loved our first conversation about cog sci and wrestling and all of that. But maybe a little
Yeah,
reminder: you live in Israel. Obviously,
right.
there's been a lot of stuff going on there. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I've actually been wanting to have this follow-up conversation since October, and actually I sent you a message on October 6th about hey, well, how about we have the follow-up conversation soon, and then for obvious reasons, plans changed. Um, yeah, I'm also in the process of more formal, like joining this little corner. I already have conversations with Chad lined up and Grim Grizz. Maybe we talked about doing something.
wow,
So
you're getting in deep.
yeah, I've been and as you said, you did predict that you predicted both things, both that probably the video itself is not going to be super popular just in terms of raw numbers, which makes sense because it was about professional wrestling, and for most people that would not seem like a topic that would um, hold a lot of relevance to the kind of things that we talk about here, and also that I'll get interest from a lot of people within the corner to have conversations. And both of those things panned out, and actually didn't for some reason I didn't realize that the Bridges of Meaning Discord was just open and I could just join whenever I wanted. And then I did, and as soon as I did, like, oh, you're a Guy the Wrestler. Oh wow. Yeah, we can talk. Um, yeah.
Status
Um,
status is a real thing, as is attention. They're not everything, but they're very real.
yeah. So yeah, so I've got those lined up. Again, I've only now, so I was in reserve duty with everything that's going on. I only now have been able to actually get back to my life like properly. Um, and so yeah, so I'm talking to you. I'm going to talk to them and a bunch of other stuff that I've got lined up, which is exciting.
Even so, it's when you look at my analytics, about half of my viewers are from the United States. Canada and the UK are sort of neck and neck in terms of second place. Australia is third, and then the Netherlands and Germany. But Israel is fairly well represented in terms of the hierarchy in the corner, which is fascinating. Of course,
Yeah.
Jacob and Pezi and Yosef. So not everyone actually in Israel, but the fact that you were called up in the United States, the country is so massive, and at least since the end of the Vietnam War, when selective service was compulsory, service in the military was ended. Israel has much more citizen soldiery than the United States, even though the United States is nearly, it's sort of like the Pax Romana. You listen to the Pax Romana and people think, oh, Romans weren't fighting. No, Romans were fighting the whole time.
Mm.
Because if you're running an empire, it means you're always having to, you know, suppress something and bomb this and do
Yeah.
that. And so
Yeah.
warfare is kind of a perpetual thing in the United States since the end of the Second World War and the rise of its own empire. But in Israel, with an event like you guys had, suddenly, well, there's a major disruption in terms of regular people in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone, practically speaking, every single Israeli was affected in some way, either um, by knowing people who were murdered or being called to serve, or in my case, both. Um, and and yeah, many people have had to leave their homes for safety reasons, for, you know. Anyway, that's probably not the topic we should be getting into
I
in
think
depth.
it's not the topic of this video, but I think it's helpful to mention because in this land of screens, there's a disembodiment
Yeah.
that everyone has a level of. But what's interesting is that, yeah, we were talking about talking in October, and then of course, well, life intervenes.
Yeah, it was literally on the 6th. I mentioned to you on Twitter that I saw after the fact. Oh, it was actually literally the day before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's definitely a level of theoretical analyzing with this conflict in particular that to me I can't stand, like, going on Twitter now and seeing a lot of half-baked, low information opinions from all sides, like talking about something that really is more complex than, you know. Anyway,
Anyway, so what are we going to talk
yeah.
about today?
So since our conversation, I've thought a lot about, and also evolved. Okay, so I thought a lot about more about wrestling and how it relates to our current moment, because you actually surprised me by how enthused you were during our conversation about this topic, and how you also thought it was relevant, but at the same time, it was hard for me, at least, to put my finger on exactly how wrestling was relevant. It actually might be a good idea to do a quick recap of exactly what pro wrestling is.
Your volume just went down for some reason. I don't know
Oh,
why. That's
weird.
better. So speak up,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
Zoom sort of tries to regulate this thing.
Okay. And then let me know if it happens again.
Okay.
Yeah, so I should probably give a little some recap of what professional wrestling is. By the way, it's been in the news in the States in the last, like, week or two. I don't know if you've seen with Vince McMahon, who was the former, like, head of
Yeah.
WWE, and there was a big scandal. And there's a lot happening right now. Most of it is actually positive. He's not been relevant for a while, which is one of the positives, because a lot of the stigma associated with pro wrestling is because he was the person running pro wrestling for the better part of 2 decades solo. And so his vision of professional wrestling was what professional wrestling became in the public's eye. And ever since he stepped down, there's been a notable increase in quality, and more wrestling being what I would say it should have been and could have been.
Is there something there in terms of when you have, let's say, a person running it as a business versus something much more organic, manifesting when that, it's sort of like a tyrant being pushed aside now, more of the forces will emerge from below? I don't know. What you
Yes.
said was very interesting to me.
Um, there's in multiple ways that is true. So there's the tyrant side, which is something we'll talk about. Actually, like one of the first point, with that you need to find the right balance, the optimal grip, between the listening to your audience and being able to follow a vision. So that's a bit later.
That's what you said there. That's like the art of leadership,
Yes.
is navigating those two poles.
Yeah, and I think okay, so we'll get there in a bit. So first, what wrestling is. It's a form of athletic theater where the actors play athletes for many years. So it's like my character, so I have a character. It's a stereotypical nerd, which we'll talk about in a second. And the character ages with me in real time. So a month for me is a month for the character. And usually a wrestler would play one character throughout their career, maybe two if there's a shift to a new location where their history doesn't matter. But usually it's around one, or one, maybe you look around a bit, but once you hit on a character, you usually stay with that character. And a match in wrestling has a 3-act narrative structure. So you have the exposition, and then the problem, and then the resolution. And so a match is going to be a good guy wrestler versus a bad guy wrestler, and usually the exposition is going to be why the good guy wrestler deserves to win. In many, it can take on many forms, either because he's a better wrestler, or because he is virtuous, or because he tries really hard, or a bunch of different stuff. And then the bad guy, the second act is the bad guy takes control and has the momentum and controls the match for a large portion of it. And then the resolution is the good guy manages to get back on top. Now, the ending of the match, either wrestler could win, and that plays into the so you have the narrative of the match, and then the meta narrative of the character across time of both characters, or more. Sometimes you have matches with more than 2 wrestlers, but you have the meta narrative of the arc of the characters involved. So the ending of the match usually plays into that. And usually the best character, so I said my character is a stereotypical nerd. Usually a character is going to be, the best ones are going to be a self-archetypification, like finding an archetype that you can embody and embodying it, and the characters are going to be more representational than like realistic. Although nowadays there's a shift there, but historically that's the case. And if you look in Mexico, where wrestling, as it's called, lucha libre, there is really like a cultural phenomenon. It's considered part of the heritage. And their characters are usually like the alchemist, the dragon, and they embody like those things with the masks and everything. And ideally the character goes through a narrative throughout its career. And so you have, in wrestling, you have matches, and you have what's called segments, which are non-match events. It could be an interview, it can be a backstage, like hidden camera, or something, like something that is beyond the match. Could be a confrontation between wrestlers. And you have what's called the booker. So each organization has the booker, who is the person, and sometimes it's a committee, but usually it's a person who is in charge of, okay, these are the wrestlers I have in my organization. What stories do I want to tell? Who do I want to feud with whom? And that person is in charge of putting together the narrative. So that's the, as far as the technical how wrestling works, that's what it is. It's very archetypal. It's very yeah, it's very archetypal.
And you're playing with the fourth wall. I mean, that's one of the interesting
Yeah, so
things about
that's
narrative. There's a ton of playing with the fourth wall. And even when you talked about the segments, which are not matches. So matches are up on a stage in an arena. So then everyone's seat is defined. But now, because of cameras and screens, now we can really play with this fourth wall.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was the next point I was going to get to, is the role of the audience in wrestling, which is really going to be key to what I want to talk about today. So the crowd, if you've ever seen a wrestling show, the crowd participates, is absolutely a part of the performance. And during COVID, it was very clear how much was missing when crowds weren't there. The crowd is very much part of the presentation. And the people who go to wrestling shows, for the most part, what they do is they play, they act as if what's happening before them is non-fictional. I was going to say real, and I changed it to non-fictional. For reasons that I'm sure you understand and will be made clear later. And that is really, really interesting because the wrestlers, both the wrestlers in the ring during the match, and also the booker or the people planning ahead, always take feedback from the crowd and play with the crowd. Like they everyone, you gauge the reactions constantly as a wrestler and as the person putting everything together. And also the character, so if I'm a good guy and I'm in a bad position, sometimes I'll call for the audience to support me and then use that adrenaline rush from getting the support to do something. So they actually literally affect the narrative of the match immediately. And from gauging reactions, the booker again is the person who puts it together. The booker decides, okay, this guy is really picking up steam. This guy, I have something with this guy. Maybe I should give him a more prominent role. Like the crowds are getting into him. And that's what happens when it's going well. And interestingly, sometimes the booker's expectation clashes with the audience, and you can see there's a collective, there's a distributed cognition of the audience, like this is not working. Something in the narrative is not working. It could be this character is not believable, or this character is not believable in this role. But for whatever reason, things just don't work. Like when something lands and it doesn't. And if the booker, so we talked about Vince McMahon and his tyranny. Vince McMahon was very stubborn, and for years, he tried to get a character. Getting something over means making it liked, in broad strokes, or making it dominant. Like a wrestler, putting a wrestler over is letting him win. And he tried to get a specific character that he wanted to be the face of the organization. He tried to get him over in a way that just didn't work for that wrestler.
Yep.
And there was a 5-year struggle or 6-year struggle from 2015 to 2019 or 2020, where he kept trying to do the same thing, putting this particular character in this particular light, and it just didn't work. It didn't land, and the audience rebelled. And at some point, it became, first of all, how does a wrestling audience rebel? A wrestling audience rebels. Some stop watching, but mostly they still go to the shows. They still participate, but they participate badly. So you, as a fan, for example, you'd boo the good guy, and you're not supposed to do that. When you know your role,
the ritual, the liturgy.
Yes.
See, this is why this is so exciting to me, because when you talk wrestling, I see church. It's so similar.
And that's really what the main thing I wanted to talk about today was that. So but you still participate, but you participate badly. So you either jeer the good guys, or you cheer the bad guys, or you create chants like "This is boring." So you do.
If that happened in church, and it would happen a lot, church would be very different.
But it's really interesting that you're doing a sports chant, which is what you're supposed to do, but you're chanting your disapproval of the product that's in front of you. And it's not just in front of you, it's that you're the product that you are participating in, actually, because that becomes part of the show at that point. If I'm watching a match on TV and this happens, that's what I'm watching on TV. I'm watching a match taking place and a crowd chanting "This is boring," or a crowd not doing what they're supposed to do, what you would expect them to do. Um, and there's a tug of war there, and at the same time, so you could be too stubborn. Vince McMahon was famously very, very stubborn about trying to have his vision take place. At the same time, his successor, who is also his son-in-law, is much, much better, and he's actually good at. He also doesn't give fans what they want in a sense, but he does it in a way where they say, "Oh yeah, it's a good thing that he didn't listen." Where after the fact, you you understand, okay, actually, he had a plan there, and I should have trusted it. And you know, he believed that the story that he was going to tell is not what the audience expects, but or thinks it wants, but it actually is what it wants. And I think that crowd dynamics, I think when you become a slave to either end, so you could be a slave to your own, I know what's best in a way that is false, or oh, they want this, I better give it to them. I think there's a form of idolatry there where you can either be loyal to the ideal that you're trying to represent in the narrative, or and again, sometimes it's tricky because you know you can do that in a bad way as well, or you can placate the audience. And culturally, in the last decade and a half, this part of it is relevant because a lot of things that didn't used to be wrestling became wrestling. A lot of places where a big thing that characterizes wrestling is that immediate audience participation and immediate feedback. And news channels, for example, now that you have Twitter and you have you can tell what the loudest voices want to see or want to hear in a way that if you're not used to dealing with that reaction, can really affect you. Oh, we need to give them everything they want, and then you get it's also, so it's either in terms of the voices you can see or the very down to the most minute level analytics where you can, okay, this article got this many clicks, this article got more clicks, and you can become a slave to that and lose, for example, if you're a news channel, the core of what makes what news should be. So there's a form of idolatry there where you follow a false idol that is the immediate popularity, the immediate gratification of getting the highest number in terms of clicks, or in terms of viewership, or in terms of the people saying so people tell you what they want, and then if you immediately listen without thinking about how it plays into the larger picture of what it is that you're doing, things can go awry. And I think a lot of surface level American culture now has that element of it where people who didn't know how to deal with loud voices telling them this is bad or this is good or you should do this. Okay, well, our audience is telling us this, so therefore we must do it. So that's the first point I was going to make. Actually, I wanted to, but I forgot. I wanted to ask you whether you, since our last conversation, had more, like, could put into more concrete words what it was about wrestling that
Well, part of the limitation of my ADHD and how that limitation has structured what has grown around me, which I use as relevance realization, is so when you're in front of me, I can see it. And you do a really good job of laying this out. What you were just talking about is just so absolutely relative, and you said it well, to news, especially to politics. Again, remember Donald Trump and his relationship with wrestling.
He is a WWE Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
Just to,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And when you talk about these institutions, wrestling, let's say it this way, the spirit of wrestling has moved into more institutions around us than ever before.
Yeah.
And so now
Yeah.
that gets into the fact that the spirit of wrestling isn't just about athletic theater or men in tights. This is a spirit that actually you can see it in the Protestant Reformation, because in some ways what you're describing is, so one way to understand the Protestant Reformation that gets billed as the Protestant Reformation, even though there are many of them, is that Germany around Wittenberg, and then in other places, happened in the UK. There was a revolt, and the way you laid it out in terms of the Booker, that because that stubbornness that McMahon had is what made him so good. This is Vervaeke's relevance realization. So the fact that he could push through with things that it seemed the crowd wasn't up on. So then eventually he was right, the crowd caught up with him. But he got so stubborn at times that he lost the crowd. And that's always a tension going on. And part of what's going on right now, I think, in terms of this little corner, is that people want to see me as the Booker, but I am not really the Booker. I've got a fair amount of influence, but there are other, and this is where I think, and I wonder if this is what's happening with wrestling. McMahon sort of had a monopoly. And when you have a monopoly, it can afford a sort of tyranny. But when that breaks down, you tend to then get marketplace dynamics, which are different, which actually strengthens the crowd. Because now the bookers have to be more attentive to the crowd, but that can have a deleterious effect to actually, and this is where it gets really hard, the quality. Because the quality, so you go back to Sevilla King and her channel, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, piercing. This quality is a very mysterious thing, which is, it's partly subjective. People have different senses of the quality. People have their preferences, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, sometimes quality becomes its own thing, that it's sort of becomes, it transcends the preferences. And that's when people get a sense of, ooh, higher quality, and even starts to feel like divinity because it's transcending. And so I think everything that you said here is just so cogent, and I think so important and accurate. It's in the similar way to the fact that if a preacher sees this and starts talking in religious terms, lots of people miss it. In the same way with that, wrestling is sort of like a church. And wrestling, we just had a live stream on this morning where a guy who's made himself a little bit famous in the comment section for being a physicalist, skeptic, atheist, sort of made a lot of noise. Well, part of what's going on here is that type of person is deeply modernistic. And when they look at wrestling, I mean, the new atheist guys, if they had a fit about religion, they'd have a huge fit about wrestling. And I'd see that in the comments from our video. Wrestling? Are you serious? Because there's an elitist snobbery with respect to it, because it is theater, but it's not Shakespeare or things that have status. It's low, and so people mock wrestling in the same way they mock religion, but they're not seeing something which is enormously powerful. And it's almost always when the elites get to a certain point that they sort of begin to despise and when we can put it in political terms, when the Democratic Party started hating its constituency, when the church starts hating its flock, when the book starts hating the fans, oh yeah, there will be a price to pay for that. And we've
Yeah.
seen that dynamic playing out in multiple areas. And one of the really nice things about wrestling is the kayfabe. Everybody knows it's wrestling, but it's these, it's this liminal space. So I think that's why I think wrestling is just such an amazing analog that is so telling about so many things that we can barely articulate. And so I think that's the genius of it. And you
Yeah.
see that and you communicate that well.
Thanks. So a couple of things there. First of all, a lot of that touches on a lot of the rest of the stuff I had in mind. Now, there is something to say about wrestling actually was or had a lot of loudliness in it for a while because of Vince McMahon and his preferences. I'll put it that way. Now, so that was the case. It's not something that they you know, there was a time where it was very easy to get disgusted by some of the things happening specifically in WWE as a company. But over the last few years, first of all, now it's as soon as wrestling becomes good, it becomes a cultural phenomenon. It happened in the late 90s. And it's happening again. We're actually in a golden age of wrestling right now. And they just signed right before the Vince allegations came out. They just signed an unprecedented deal with Netflix
Oh, really?
So
Oh,
starting
wow.
January 2025, Raw, which is one of the flagship shows, is going to be on Netflix. And internationally, it's actually going to be Netflix is going to be the home of wrestling.
And that shows so many
Excuse me.
transitions, the transition from cable to streaming. And it's also the fact that it shows a breadth for Netflix that Netflix has been trying to gain.
Yeah.
And it will also, again, as what happened in the 90s, it will tend to mainstream wrestling again, like it was in the 90s and then sort of dropped out of. And when you look at these religious tides, it's a similar thing. Religions go up and down, similar to the way wrestling goes up and down.
Yep. Yeah, so that's and it at least for wrestling, it has a lot to do with the leadership and the vision. Because actually for the past 3 years or so, 2.5, wrestling actually has already been going through a boom period. And you can look if you look at the ratings, it's consistently the top rated show now. A lot of people who gave up on wrestling have come back in the last 2 years, again, since Vince stepped down and his son-in-law took over, and you can see there's a lot of people that you don't know are wrestling fans that I know are wrestling fans in the popular culture, because like it's this thing that and you'd be surprised by how many of them there are and how ubiquitous really wrestling is when you know to look for it.
Yep.
And as for, you said you were talking about quality, right? About there being, it's subjective, but at the same time, it's objective. We'll talk about transjective in a different way a bit later, but I think it has to do. So, okay, so I've been trying to think for a while what makes us how can you tell that a story is good? And I think I have some sort of theory. Can I share my screen?
Oh, let me give that permission. Gosh. Uh, um, come on, come on. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Actually, let's see if whiteboard works. Okay, good. Okay, so let's say this is your immediate life, and so I'm going to build a hierarchical structure. Can you see my cursor, by the way?
Yep, I
Am
see
moving
it.
Okay.
Yep.
So let's say something happens. Let's say your son got married. You're engaged in that, right? You're interested.
Yep.
Okay, but you're obviously interested, right? Because the degree of separation here is very small. Like it's very relevant to you in an immediate way.
Yep.
Okay, now it might be something more distant. Maybe the his wife's sister, something happened there. Now you're still going to be interested, but less so. And then if I tell you John Levkowitz just had a child, you don't really care about that, right?
Don't know who he is. No, right.
Exactly. Yeah, I just made it up. But what happens if something that's completely foreign to you, how do you get something that's completely foreign to you? If something that's completely foreign to you engages you, for example, you watch Better Call Saul, right? And you don't know any of these people, they're fictional characters. But there's something there that engages you, right? So what I would posit is that the further away it is, the deeper in terms of your internal mechanisms you have to go in order for it to be relevant. So
yes,
actually being engaged in something that's on the surface completely foreign is a sign that it is very profound.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, good. So that's what I wanted to share. Then you can
Yeah.
sort
No,
of
I think that's
imagine.
very true. And so then these structures. So if you were to tell me that whatever this dude's name was is a pro wrestler, well, that would go into this conversation. But
Yep.
when, let's say, okay, so a current example that King Charles has
cancer.
Oh, okay. Well, now we're going deep, and he's not even my king. I mean, the whole American Revolution, but Americans still follow him. And then Pope Francis, there's all this drama around the Pope, and it's like, I'm Protestant, I'm American, I'm not connected to Charles, I'm not connected to the Pope. Oh, but and so then someone comes along and says, I've got proof Martin Luther was gay. And it's boom, now suddenly, no, you're exactly right that where I think that's an excellent observation.
Good. So then the next thing is going to be related to McGilchrist, which is why, we have a corpus of stories that is at the base of our culture, both of our cultures. And why is it a story? So I was thinking of because you have essentially two ways of representing ideas. One is a story, the other is a model, an abstraction. So what I just did, for example, was a model with the points and the lines. And what's the difference between them? What are they? So here's my thinking on it right now. And actually, I'm reading McGilchrist's book. I've been listening to him for a while, but I'm reading his book also because it's going to play into my PhD, probably, his work. And essentially, stories are the master brain, the right brain way of representing reality, whereas models are left brain. And a good model is going to be actually immune to interpretation. The point of a model is to decontextualize it in such a way that there is nothing there left to misconstrue. A model is aimed to distill a specific idea in a specific way. It's a freezing in time of a concept and taking it outside of any
Yep.
any grounding.
Yep. And it's to, you know, in my language, it's to raise it up. It gets it up off the ground. And so
Yes.
it's transcendent, it's universal in some, well, that's the hope of it. But then there will be issues.
Even if, yeah, so even if it is, it might be universal, but it's not everyone is going to either understand it or be able to, it's not transjective.
Right.
Is where I'm going with this. And stories are, a story is a representation of actually how we perceive the world. And because our cultural stories, actually, you know, give me a second. I'm gonna fill up some water because the.
Oh, okay. I'll pause. I'll fill up my water too.
So stories are transjective, and because the stories that we're talking about at the bedrock of our culture are profound because of how the stories that are profound manage to survive across time, and the evolution of religion and all that stuff, then because these are profound stories, no matter how distant you find them, you should be able to connect with them on some level based on what the model that I just gave, if it's correct.
Right.
So
because we have deep, even just the physicality, because, you know, this personhood. I mean, there's super deep reasons why even in this model we can connect with stories. Yep. Tracking.
Yeah, so these stories, because they can touch our deepest, like the deepest recesses of our minds or souls or whatever. It doesn't matter how distant they are to any one individual. There's always something there to grab onto. And also stories, they're not a distillation, so they have a lot of what could for some reason would just be noise, but they have a lot of distinct parts, and this allows for much broader relevance realization, much more encompassing. So for me, if I watch a show, I can identify with one part and completely ignore another part, which is like the time of day or the day of the week. And for some people, maybe that will hold some significance, whereas something I'm interested in wouldn't. So a story has a lot of different parts that that can serve as a basis for connection and understanding, and then you can have a culture that's based on the same stories, and everyone agrees that it should be based on those same stories. So there's like I wrote here, a story allows for a generalizable hyperspecificity. So anyone can find their own very specific situation in a good story.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
It's also important to recognize, while we're being meta here, that what we are doing is modeling story.
Yep. Which is what I just did earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there was just a live stream with somebody who's kind of made a little name for himself at the moment as a skeptic in the corner again. And it was so interesting because once you begin to recognize the elements of this model and you hear people talk, it's like, oh yeah, I just want clarity. Okay. And you begin to notice that, okay, I just want this. I'm really frustrated with, let's say, wrestling again. I'm really frustrated with wrestling because it doesn't fit it isn't a model. No, that's right. Wrestling is not a model. You can derive some models from it. You can learn about models through it. But the fact that it isn't a model, And so if you
Yeah,
become a dogmatist with respect to models, well, there's a certain amount of, you can't actually live in models because
and
they're not transjective.
exactly. And I would absolutely put stories above models in the hierarchy, if only for the fact, so to talk to someone like that, the reason would be that it's much easier to take a story and create a compelling story and create a compelling model from that story, and you can think of literature analysis, than it would be the other way around.
Right.
You can't just take a model and, okay, craft a compelling story around that model.
Right.
Um,
it was funny when, for a while, Peugeot was talking about story, and people were like, okay, I'm going to take the model of an archetype, I'm going to craft a story around it. And those always make terrible stories.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. You can tell when a story is aimed to transmit a specific model, where compared to when it's organic.
Yeah, that's why Christian movies are often so terrible, because certain Christianity, especially in Protestantism, well, here's the model, so let's make a story that perpetuates the model. It's usually a terrible story.
Yep. As a quick aside before moving on to the next point, that actually, if someone is interested in seeing a struggle session between wrestling and its audience, there's one actually happening right now as we speak. We talked about, so Vince McMahon was the tyranny aspect. Now WWE was bought by Endeavor, Ari Emanuel, in which Ari Gold from Entourage was based. For those of you who watched Entourage, that I think should tell you everything you need to know. And it's unclear exactly yet to what extent, but it might be, what might be happening is that they're shafting a very compelling 2-year-long story that was supposed to culminate in WrestleMania, which is the biggest event, and it's in April. It's in 8 weeks, and and there was a change in gears where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson just he became part of the board, and now he perhaps is going to replace by all accounts, the protagonist of the last 2 years of wrestling.
He's going back into wrestling. I thought he left wrestling.
Yeah, he left wrestling, and now he's on the board of the company that bought WWE.
Oh,
and
boy.
Yeah, and he's involved again, and it's unclear to what level he is exerting his influence, or the bosses are looking at the most immediate bottom line, which is also a form of idolatry. But there's a chance, it's been left open to interpretation, but there's a chance that they're trying to change the story in a completely unnatural way, and there's a revolt happening right now. The hashtag "We Want Cody," Cody Rhodes is the other protagonist, has been trending for many days straight in the United States.
Wow.
Because of this.
I type in hashtag "we," and Wednesday Motivation is the first one, and "We Want Cody."
"We Want Cody" is the second.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's part of the issue of social media, is that you can be on Twitter and know nothing about what, in fact, may be occupying Twitter, because of course it's also targeted. And so what's happening, this will never come up in what's happening until now that I've hit on it. Now Twitter is going to be feeding me wrestling news.
Yeah. And it's going to, because the main, the match that The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, is going to have, or potentially going to have, is not even a bad match. It just doesn't fit the narrative at the present moment, and it feels very artificial. Like it's a match against his cousin in a story that's been heavily involving the family, because it's a wrestling family. So it makes sense, and he's also a big star, and there's room for this story, just not right now. And there was already the revolt started as soon as the inklings and wrestling fans know a pivot when they see it, um and also they know that if they really care about this, they're undeniable, and they really care about this. And there's a revolt happening right now. So you can watch the last Monday Night Raw to see the beginning of it on TV, but you also many news outlets, because wrestling is hot right now. News outlets picked because of that, and because it's The Rock, and there's a lot of stuff worthy of a story there. Picked up how The Rock came back to WWE and the fans aren't happy, which is not usually the response he gets. So that's just as an aside. Over you can actually see it happening live.
Yep.
All right. So the next point was going to be wrestling as religious ritual. So we just talked about narrative and what a compelling narrative is, and now there was a compelling narrative being told over 2 years, and it suddenly, like, imagine you're watching a movie and then out of nowhere a new character comes in, or a character that was briefly introduced at the beginning and suddenly becomes the protagonist, and that's not the person you were invested in, and you can see how that would be jarring and not work. But when wrestling works, it really works, and it can be the most engaged. So my most engaged moments in fictional media have been in wrestling. Absolutely. Now a lot of times it doesn't work, partially because there's a lot of moving parts, and you have the booker and you also have the wrestlers, and wrestlers can get injured and derail plans. And and there's a lot of bottom upness to wrestling that makes it, when it works really well, but it can also be very messy. But when it works, it does seem to touch something deep. And that reveals it touches on something deep. And when you're there in the audience, if I see a match, just the last minute of a match, I can tell whether it was a good match or not based on just the vibe that you get from the audience. You can get a certain energy. And here's the rub with wrestling, where it is absolutely, in my mind, a religious ritual. When you watch fiction, you watch the fiction, usually, right? You watch a movie, or you consume fiction, you are separate from the fiction. And when you're engaged in something, it's usually something real. Like when you're participating. So there's a participatory element in being an audience for sports, but that's quote unquote real. But in wrestling, you have people actively participating and investing themselves in such a way, not just investing in like you would in a movie, but actually participating, taking part in a fiction, in a way that, again, to a modernist would be, why are you doing this? But I think it's a secular vehicle that shows how non-literal truth can drive people. When wrestling is true, it absolutely drives people. It makes you chant, it makes you invested, makes you participate in the performance. So that's one thing. And the other is a point about propositional versus participatory knowing, because there's a sense in which the textual stories that our cultures are based upon are propositional. but the rituals are participatory. And I think if you don't think about it, like if you ask a Christian, which is in service of the other, they would probably say that the ritual is in service of embodying the story in a better way. But there's an argument to be made that it's either equally important or the other way around. And in wrestling, I think it's clearly the other way around in how it operates. So the narrative, the propositional narrative is absolutely in service of the participatory performance. That is the match, which involves the audience and all that stuff. And
That's definitely true.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's, I mean, when again, if you look at in Christianity, sort of what sort of separates the Protestant from the Catholics and the Orthodox, they have tended to prioritize the ritual, and the Protestants have tended to prioritize the propositional. But
prioritize the
again,
text.
these
Yeah.
are massive movements, and you can find very propositional Orthodox and Catholics and very ritual participatory Protestants. And part of what made that movement so complex was a big part of the Protestant Reformation was the priesthood of all believers. What that meant was now suddenly the priesthood was participatory on a massive scale in Protestantism, which was supposed to be propositional, but now it was massively participatory. And so what you see are just all of this subtleness. And you can see that even in this, to the limited degree that I understand this present audience revolt in wrestling, where, I mean, The Rock, that's propositional. There's a real human being with skin around him. And, you know, Cody, they're propositional. And so, and that's part of the difficulty here, is that people sometimes want to say, out with the propositional. You couldn't articulate that sentence or promote that idea without
exactly.
the propositional. It's, you need nouns and verbs. It's just the way it is.
Yeah. You definitely you need both, because there's also in wrestling, you can see there's in a mocking way, there's what's called a heatless banger. A banger is like a really good match, athletically or technically, but it's heatless. There's no heat to it. There's no underlying narrative holding it together. So you definitely need both.
Yep.
By the way, just as a because I'm sure people will say it, and I didn't explicitly outright talk about this. Wrestling fans know that wrestling is a performance. They know that it's fiction. It's because a lot of the people who watch wrestling, and this is a modern thing, they must not know that it's fictional. And I think there's a lot with that that's parallel to religion. If they're invested in this, if they participate in this, then they must be fooled by it. It hasn't tried to fool anyone for over 50 years now, but therefore they must be. That's the only explanation.
Yeah.
And so no, so just as a
and so that's where the Enlightenment with religion gets really interesting, because and you've seen this played out recently when Jordan Peterson was talking about religion as fictional. And
yeah.
And at first, the new atheist, like Alex O'Connor, at first was sort of like, see, he said it. But the more Alex O'Connor began to understand what Peterson meant by fictional, the more Alex O'Connor had to sort of back away, because this was sort of tried in the modernist fundamentalist fight at the beginning of the 20th century in religion and Protestantism in America, because modernists tried to say, oh, it's fictional. And so then the fundamentalists said, no, it's literal. And of course, that's a terrible word. And what the entire fight has been trying to get one's head around is, in fact, what do these terms really mean when we're talking about history, let's say, but then you have the question of history, and then you get these fights over, did Jesus walk on water? And then you begin to get a sense of, okay, well, what exactly are we really talking about here in terms of that importance? I mean, because, and what's interesting, again, as you put it out initially with respect to wrestling, it's that Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, has always been both things. Now,
Yeah.
he was in the wrestling world for a while, and then he just kind of drops out. And then he's in the Hollywood world, and he's making movies, and he's having a career, and he's doing all of this, and now he's dipping into the wrestling world. And the fact that your character, you've got two identities because you're in two different realms.
Yes. Which is so that's okay. So
Yeah, okay,
yeah,
he's
no,
right.
there's a
There's a
there's a
lot
thought I'm
here.
trying to, yeah. Because in wrestling there's on the one hand it's very clearly fictional and people are engaged with it as fiction, but on the other, at the same time, there is a lot of pulling from real life in terms of what the narrative is based on. So for example, Cody is a second generation wrestler.
Yeah, no, you
His
start getting the generations into this. Holy cow.
Yeah, and his father, his whole narrative is based on the fact that his father, um, is everything okay?
Yeah, I'm just looking
Oh,
because it's
oh, okay.
Cody Rhodes. And I'm
Yes,
old
the son
enough
of,
and know even just a little bit enough for us to say, oh, he's a Rhodes.
he's the son of Dusty Rhodes, yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and Dusty Rhodes, his experience in WWE was, in a sense, humiliating. There was something there, and again, Vince McMahon being vindictive, and Dusty Rhodes was a big star in the NWA, which was the competition. And when he came in, he was humiliated, and he never won the title, the championship in the main championship in WWE. And as a wrestler, it's fictional winning the championship, but at the same time,
It's
it's a
very
huge
real.
honor. Yeah. And there was Dusty Rhodes actually used to be a booker as well, and he coined what's called the Dusty Finish. Dusty Finish is where you seemingly have one outcome, seemingly the good outcome. So you do it with a heel, which is a bad guy, a heel champion. So you create a situation wherein it looks like the good guy won, and he's holding the title over his head, and he's happy. But then the referee, like there maybe one referee got dropped, and then another came in, and the referee's talking. Then no, actually, we're going to have to nullify the outcome because this and this and this happened. And that's called a dusty finish. Because it's both Dusty and also because Dusty invented it. And he had a Dusty finish with the WWE Championship, where he won it but didn't win it, and he never actually won the championship. And Cody was in WWE years ago, and then he went out and actually started the closest thing to a modern day competition to WWE, and then he came back. He was part of the founding class of that organization. But since he came back, he's been made like anointed. Okay, we like what he's been doing and the way he interacts with the fans, and we see something here. And his story has been to win the championship that his dad never won. And something that's known is that in the negotiations, that was actually one of the issues. Like he took the championship from the wall, the memento, the championship that his dad never won, but like there was it was on the wall,
Right, there was a
and he put it,
shrine.
yeah,
There was a
and
temple.
in coming back, because you know he was a key player for the competition. For part of the reason for coming, I'm coming back because I want to win the championship that my dad never did.
Powerful archetypal story.
Yeah, and that's the story that's been playing out over the last 2 years, and the hashtag, there's like, or the tagline would be "Finish the story," and that's finish your dad's story, the story that your dad never managed to finish, and that's the engaging story that's happening right now, and it's very much based on reality, but at the same time, it's a fictional story,
Yes.
and there's and so we talked about, you know, The Rock, and the agentic relationship in wrestling is extremely interesting. The agent arena relationship, because The Rock in many ways was actually the same character he was in WWE in his movies. He actually tried doing something else, and then they told him, no, people want to see The Rock when they go to your movies. And the Rock was surprisingly the same, like didn't morph when he switched arenas. But the thing with the Cody Rhodes, the character, is very much Cody Rhodes, the person, with specific aspects of it turned up, and that's also something that we all do. Like we're slightly different people in different contexts. And yeah, so it's just when you talked about the switch there, like all that came rushing in, and I had to put it back in order.
Well, and if you know, this gets really nerdy. If you'd read a book like Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, I mean, Charles Taylor talks about different times, like the traditional societies had different times, and so that John Vervaeke gets at that with the agent arena. So you're right that there's definitely a connection between Cody Rhodes in the ring and Cody Rhodes in life, and again, wrestling, because you hold character in a way, but you're in two different arenas.
Yeah,
And you know, and clergy understand that too. When you're in church, you're in a particular arena, but there's tension between those arenas, because people wonder, well, are you the same when you're up there speaking, preaching the word of God, and when you're at home with your family, are you the same? And that's that same question as to what degree do these two realms relate to one another? And as human beings, we're very conscious of that, because we, at a very deep level, even ardent secularists, understand different realms.
yeah,
And
yeah, and I think there's also a modern illusion that you have a personality, and then you take that personality and put it into different places, but you don't have a personality. You have the thing that you bring into different contexts, that then you have a transjective way of being.
yes,
Um, and so I know it for myself, both for when I'm performing as a wrestler, obviously, but that is very much a character that is based on an aspect of it, but it's very much a character. But also when I was recording, so if you remember, I have this Hebrew course that
oh yeah,
I
that's right.
recorded. Yeah. And when I'm recording it, I'm noticing myself being a different person, and it's a consistent different person. It's a performance. It's not a performance of not me, but it is a performance. It's the arena is definitely different. So I have no doubt that you are different in your everyday life than you are in front of the camera, and then different yet to when you are preaching.
Right. But if the difference is too much, then suddenly you get, Jesus was the one who popularized this word hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And you have two faces. Well, you can't have two faces. What you need is one face that can do different things.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and it all has to be ingrained in the same thing. And in wrestling, if it isn't, then in acting as well,
Yes.
then you can tell. And that's what happened originally with, remember, Roman Reigns. That was the person that Vince McMahon tried to make him a character that just wasn't the person. Vince McMahon had a vision of what the good guy character should be, and he's been trying to do it for. It stuck with John Cena, who is now also in Hollywood and doing bigger and bigger things, and he's becoming a lot like The Rock in terms of how ubiquitous he's going to be, and how much you're going to see him everywhere. So it worked with him, but the character didn't work with Roman Reigns, who is now the champion. That's the person against whom Cody is trying to finish the story. That's the person holding the championship. He's been holding it for 4 years now. Successfully is a character that actually works. And by the way, 4 years it's the third or fourth longest reign ever. And all the way back to the 80s or 70s and like Hulk Hogan. And so it's really this reign ending is pivotal. It's like this has been building up for a long time. And there's the Cody story converging with Roman Reigns' story. And before that, actually, The Rock himself, he didn't work at first in 1996 because Vince tried to give him that same character, and it didn't land. And so you can't be duplicitous. You can't be something that's not you.
Right.
But being different things in different contexts, you're not one thing.
Right.
There's the thing that you bring to a situation, and you can be authentic by bringing that thing, and it's going to look differently in different contexts, but you're still that one thing. Yeah. Okay. So there's one more point I wanted to make. I watched your conversation with Vervaeke today that you just had, and at the end, he mentioned something that really fit with this conversation. So, using Vervaekeanisms, wrestling as a model for self-correcting optimal grip via distributed cognition. So I'll explain. He mentioned Schellenberger's evolving religion, and a lot of that was really relevant. So in wrestling, what you do is you have people who are wrestlers, and they have a character and they try to embody, and they start small. They start from their local scene, and then if it works, they get noticed, and then they go up to like a bigger organization. You have organizations of different sizes, and eventually, if it really works, you get to WWE. Alternatively, WWE also takes people and teaches them wrestling. But if you come from the independents, that's how it looks. So there is a bottom-up relevance realization there of both who am I as a wrestler, what's my character, what do I bring, and then does it land, does it grip people, and then there's a constant feedback loop of you present a narrative, you get feedback, and it's always an ongoing narrative. Wrestling never stops. You present a narrative, you get feedback. There's the interplay there between telling the narrative and getting the feedback, and the story is always evolving. So a story that worked really well in the 90s is not going to work necessarily as well today. There are aspects of it that might, but it has to be presented differently. And this is, in a sense, a process of the optimal narrative for the time self-realizing. So that opponent processing between, it's not quite opponent processing, but it's the it is the tension between there's the narrative that I want to tell, and then how it gets,
Right.
how it's received.
Right.
And so Vervaeke, I quoted almost verbatim what he meant when he mentioned Schellenberger's evolving religion. So yeah, he was talking about skepticism. Skepticism breaks up procedural and substantive justice, which was, by the way, a great distinction that he made there. And that allows you to explore imaginal and therefore non-belief centric notions of faith. That is a skeptical attitude because it is an ongoing, evolving, optimal group relationship to the sacred.
Yep. Yep.
And I think wrestling stumbled upon a model that actually does that. So wrestling, by virtue of it being an archetypal narrative at the core, it can get at the very least very close to the sacred in what it does. So and that's sort of why I wanted to do this whole thing about what is a narrative and what narrative grips, and why we need narrative as a culture to be like the unifying thing. And for wrestling, that narrative is, so you have both what characters work. Okay, it's bottom up. In the very, if you ask Peterson, that's also how religion evolved. Like, okay, there's sort of, okay, this story works. I don't know why, but it works, and we're gonna
Right.
slowly over time that corpus evolves and becomes
Right.
So wrestling is a constant process of that happening.
Yep.
And I think that could serve as a model, perhaps.
Well,
Because I don't think, yeah, okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your sentence.
So my friend is volunteering in the Vervaeke Foundation. He was actually, if you remember, Vervaeke was talking about the AI project that of Awakening from the Meaning Quest. That was actually my friend's idea at first. Like he approached them with that. And a lot of the I hope it succeeds. The project that Vervaeke is engaged in. You mentioned you were skeptical. I am also, I have my.
It depends on exactly what we mean by success. Because John is increasingly, I mean, even the conversation I just had with him with respect to the Silk Road, that was the first time I heard him say, you don't live on the Silk Road. You live on what the Silk Road connects, which I think he's continuing to nuance his ideas of legacy religions. Because the truth is, there are dead religions that you really can't inhabit because the traditions have been severed. And there are living religions. And living religions are always changing. So one of the videos that isn't out yet, but I've had so much stuff to push through the channel. It's hard to get pacing right because you put out a new video, it hurts the previous video. But religions are always evolving. And the thing about religions is religions are trying to keep their narrative integrity while they're still evolving. And so when John is talking about optimal grip and fittedness, because early on, my second conversation with John, I basically talked to him about Pascal's spirit of geometry and spirit of finesse, which in some ways maps onto McGilchrist. The master brain is much more the spirit of finesse narrative. It's geometry, the emissary brain. So and another thing that I see often in the new atheist debates, people will say, well, we believe science instead of religion because it works. Technically, science doesn't actually work. What they're really talking about is technology works. I believe in science because my cell phone can make a connection.
I
And
think a broader way of saying it would be the predictions in a very narrow, decontextualized
right,
way.
right. But the predictions are always tested in the actual, in this rich physical world that has everything in here. And religions are constantly being tested that way too.
Yeah.
Especially, part of what happens in the Protestant Reformation is that there's sort of a breakout of, it's exactly the dynamic. It's very much the dynamic you're talking about when this is boring. That's because we're still looking for optimal grip. And one way to
Yeah.
read, let's say, the Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, look at the story of someone like Gideon. God comes to Gideon and you're gonna free Israel from the Midianites. Gideon is skeptical, rightly so. And then so Gideon starts going about the process of gathering as huge an army. And you almost get the sense in the book of Judges that when Israel is actually together, she's going to be unbeatable, but she's never together. There's always the different tribes and they don't get along. They've got their internecine rivalries, et cetera, et cetera. So Gideon decides he's going to get the whole team together. And once we got the whole team together, we're going to smash the Midianites. And God comes in and says, too much. What do you mean too much? There's no such thing as too much in a war like this. No, too much. So I want you to, then he starts paring it down. And, those who drink with the cupped hands and those who lap, and pares it down to 300. And then all right away, but before then, he had all this fleece testing, Gideon's fleece and all of this stuff going on. All of this stuff is about optimal grip. And it's this back and forth. It's very transjective. And the same thing between the booker and the audience. And the same thing that you just laid out. And especially now, part of the disaster, bookers want a lot of power, but what they couldn't stop was Dusty Rhodes having an athletic son. And probably a good-looking son because Dusty Rhodes showed competence. So his wife was probably very hot, which means that his son is both athletic and charismatic, good-looking. Oh, now there's a problem. And then he's out in another wilderness. I mean, you can just work this thing all over the place. And that's again why I can see how wrestling really works. And wrestling, now people are going to wrestle with the thing I'm about to say now. It's revelatory.
Yeah.
Reality is revealed through wrestling. And he said, well, this is fiction. This is theatrical athleticism. Yes, but it's also revelatory. And it's revelatory on lots of different levels, just in the same way that literature is revelatory. So, where I'm totally tracking with you, and I agree with you 100%. That it's that part of what happened with science, and part of the reason that we're seeing the collapse of institutions based on the dogmatism of science was that it was overplayed, and we saw this with COVID. People are seeing this all over the place with respect to medical technology. And as a pastor, I see it all the time. And that isn't to say that we haven't seen amazing leaps forward through medical technology and public health and individual medical practice. We have. It's near miraculous, but it has its limits. and so, and part of what was, I really enjoy my conversations with you is because you're getting a PhD in cognitive science, and
Hopefully.
hopefully,
No. Yeah, I'm still getting
And
I'm still in the process. Yeah.
and you're a wrestler. And so it's, again, you have a transjective relationship between these two, and they're all in you.
Yep.
And so all of this, I mean, all of this is salient for you because you're living it out. And as you said, with respect to the big relationships, well, the oldest stories in the world, the deepest stories in the world are the religious stories. I
Mhm.
mean, just look at the book of Genesis. Those stories, we continue to pour and analyze, and I mean, it's hard for many lay people out there to appreciate the amount of scrutiny and battering and dissection and just about every level that the book of Genesis has undergone for thousands of years. And we still can't get away from the thing. And so, no, but these things, these levels go all over the place. So when so I didn't know who Cody was. I didn't know who Roman was. And then you said he's the son of a wrestler. And over on this screen over here, I, did the little search for hashtag we want. And Cody, I didn't see the last name because it wasn't salient to me. And then you said
Yeah.
he's the son of a wrestler. So my eyes dart over there. Is his last name on there? Rhodes. Bang. Dusty Rhodes. It's like, oh, yeah. Vince McMahon and the wrestling establishment is dealing with something very real, which is basically human reproduction and human pair bonding, and the fact that Dusty Rhodes, if I remember him correctly, walking down the street, we wouldn't look at the guy and say, yeah, no, but he rose on that hierarchy. He's going to have a very good looking wife there, and off we go. I mean, these things have been playing out forever in politics, in religion, and all of the things, because they're very, very deep.
Yep. And there's a reason I think this story is tracking as much as it is, and you can see in wrestling live what actually grips, what stories work, what stories don't. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that, because you get a peek into a very noticeable and easily discernible manifestation of distributed cognition
Yep.
within that audience. And that audience is a general audience, I would argue. It's not there's nothing specific about wrestling audiences that they're different from
High
the
and low
population at large.
IQ, very different nationalities. It's a very broad audience. And when you asked about my skepticism about John's project, and my question is always like, what exactly is your project? Because one of the things that we see in this little corner of the internet is it tends to be people with pretty high IQ. Because, I mean, if you're going to be navigating these fancy Vervaeke words, John Vervaeke gets up in front of a general audience, eyes glazed over, because you're going to have to appropriate all of this language to figure out what he's talking about. And we see this with the skeptics, because as this thing grows in visibility, you're going to draw the attention of more and more skeptics, and people are going to be skeptical and scoffing, and they're saying, oh, these fancy Vervaeke words are word salad. And Richard Dawkins says of Jordan Peterson, people just think he's impressive because they don't understand. It's like, that is a stupid argument. I regularly watch really smart people in front of people who don't understand, and they're not fascinated by it. They're bored by it.
Yep.
So, and as a Christian minister, I understand all of these dynamics. So, but
what's happening there is, and I see this a lot, and it's a very left-brain way of thinking, is I can't understand it, therefore it is not understandable.
Exactly. That's so, because there's this little there's this little fallacy that creeps in, which is that, oh, I've learned this new tool, this tool of transcendence. All of this left brain stuff is very transcendent. And so then they think that if they, exactly like you said, if they can't see it, it's gibberish. Oh, okay. And once you see that enough, you know that on one hand, you just can't talk somebody out of that, because
Yeah.
the whole facade of the left brain is, well, if I make arguments, then they'll come around. Oh, you have no idea how a human being works if you believe that.
Yeah, I think Dawkins thinking he's anti-dogmatic is a huge irony.
Yes, yes, yes.
Specifically him.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially him.
But that spirit is very much out there. And
yeah,
this,
no,
of course,
absolutely.
is what McGilchrist has been going on about.
He himself is a representation of something very relevant. So my skepticism could just be my lack of knowledge, because to my great shame, I actually haven't finished Into the Meaning Crisis yet, and I'm still getting into that stuff. I partly blame my fiance because we said we'd do it together, and we're doing it, but because we have to find time to do it together, it's slower than it would be otherwise.
You're watching Awakening from the Meaning Crisis with your fiance?
I'm so lucky, right?
Actually, one of the videos, I've always got 10 videos on my mind that I want to make. One of them is another recent little ripple in the corner has been, what about the spouses of these strange people?
Yeah, I just saw the video, and I saw you say, and yeah, our wives sort of tolerate, and I was like, no, she's right there with me.
There you go. Lucky are you.
Yeah.
Lucky are you.
Yeah. I certainly feel lucky. But to the extent that I understand it, I think there's something missing there, and you touched on it, and that you have an ecology of practices. Why? If like for the average person, okay, so there's these things here, and Verveke has the reasons, but to me they all sound like model reasons. Like they all sound, there's things that need to happen differently, and the whole thing is modeled beautifully. And the models helped me greatly in understanding myself and evolving my outlook. But there isn't a compelling narrative undergirding it, and perhaps you're going to go back to your own narrative, but why would you go out into the Silk Road in the first place?
Yep. And this is why you go out into the Silk Road. So again, the guy that was just on Luke's Grail Country live stream this morning, and this, again, as a pastor, you see the patterns. Grew up in a household of alcoholics. Terrible childhood.
As a dyslexic, you see the patterns, especially, by the way. But that's
really?
But that would be what I would argue. That's what I'm probably going to yeah, so as a dyslexic, your hyper right brain, as I sent you a link about that. And that means better. My point, that's what I'm going to research.
Huh.
Is going, and this sort of something again that me and my fiance came up with together because she's dyslexic. And we had the realization, okay, dyslexia is characterized by an inability to hold abstract patterns, decontextualized patterns, but there's a trade-off relationship there. And if you look at the upsides of dyslexia, those are all related to being able to recognize patterns irrespective of what you already, of your prediction. So right brain is the new, left brain is the old. And so when you're more open to the new, it's easier for. So do you know the game Set with the cards?
No.
So it's a game where you have, okay, you know Where's Waldo?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when because we tried testing it out, it was actually one of the predictions. Okay, if this is true, then you're probably going to be much better at Where's Waldo than me. So we opened the book together and tried to started looking for the characters, and she was 3 to 1. So for every one I found, she found 3.
Wow.
Um,
That's
because
interesting.
the patterns, and if you look up the game set, I expect that you would be surprisingly good at it compared to an average person, because um the patterns reveal themselves to you. The set is a game of finding patterns, finding matching cards.
Hmm.
Um, and when you're not bogged down by decontextualized patterns, which is what makes the spelling issues manifest, and also forgetting names, that's a huge thing. Because names are not, there's nothing about a name that, unless you find a specific connection, but a name is an arbitrary thing that you assign
Um,
to something.
a modern name.
Or,
A modern name is not an ancient name.
yeah, yeah. So that's what I said about finding a context to associate it with. Um, and so you lose the ability to hold decontextualized patterns, or not lose, but it's harder compared to the average person.
Hmm.
But what you gain is the ability, and there's a lot. If you look at if you read McGilchrist, it's very obvious that that's probably what's happening.
Hmm.
Taking with that the fact that dyslexic people are hyper right brain. Um, you're more open to updating your world. What I hope would be the case, because that allows me to tie into my research. And my original point was, how does worldview affect perception? That was my like fascination. And so presumably I would, again, still need to do the research, but that's what I'm going to get into. But presumably you're less bogged down by your worldview if you're dyslexic. You're more open to things revealing themselves, as opposed to um um like putting your
Yeah. Yeah.
making reality fit your expectation.
Yeah. That's why everybody's always
Um,
upset with me, because I'm not the Calvinist they're looking for. Usually looking to hate. So we were talking about
anyway,
Vervaeke's,
yeah, and you're talking about you talked about noticing patterns
yeah,
as a
yeah,
pastor, and
yeah.
I said it's also as a dyslexic. Yeah, so noticing patterns.
Well, Rothschild, and then people have had really chaotic, difficult growing up. They find religion, bang, because suddenly you find a community, and especially if you find a really good community, a community of people that have a capacity for love and for giving and and if you haven't had enough of that growing up, boy, you're going to get drawn to that like crazy. But then, I just posted my conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield today. But then there's going to be other questions about this religion. And so then there's going to be more testing, and then people sometimes then bounce out. But, they've already established a degree of healing and success and everything, and then they bounce out and kind of live out there. But they, what the religion does very well, and part of why religion has been adaptive, in terms of evolution, is that it's communitarian. It holds people together. Now, that's where religions and nationalisms are sort of competitors, because they're sort of operating in the same way, but they're also different in other ways. But many of the dynamics in politics and religion are strikingly similar. But people are always having to fit their optimal grip, and they will. One of the things that people don't understand is that everybody has a degree of dissonance within any system or community that they're inhabiting. And the question as to whether or not you're going to leave the community, that has a lot to do with incentive structures. Again, these are massive things because they're very real. And so then this low language of optimal grip, someone can stay in a bad marriage for a long time if certain things are true. Other people can't
think
stay in a bad marriage anytime at all because, I mean, these are enormously complex things because we are enormously complex creatures.
And a lot of it, I think, is related to the outside frame. So, for example, in leaving a community, there's dissonance between me and the community. But if you're individual focused, that's very different than being community focused or community oriented. So, what has to change? Me or the community? I think that's another, and that's a cultural thing.
Yeah. Well, there's so many
plays.
layers to all of these things in any given individual, which is why models, at a certain point, you need the models because models are helpful data. But if you're a therapist or a pastor or someone who's dealing with individuals, you're going to need some models. But no individual in front of you is a model. They're all, so you're gonna, if you can't do the transjective, and this in some ways is the difference between someone who knows a great deal of psychology but can't be a therapist, because there's a whole other sets of skills and practices and rituals that you need to employ to actually help an instantiation,
and all that is and how you unravel in a good way, like reveal McGilchrist's main point, which is the emissary brain is not bad, but it has to be in service of the master brain.
Right. Because we are people.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, when the left brain goes too far, it forgets what we are, which is an astounding thing for a human being. But you can only hold that for a while, and then your wife leaves you. Because if you're so much up here, you're probably going to have trouble being a father or a spouse or a good employee, because the world is just so full of people. And in many ways, I see this playing out politically. I know people who are in politics, and they're always like, they're so frustrated because what they want politics to be is a competition between models and policies. And in American presidential elections, it's like, how on earth could Donald Trump win? That's not so really hard to see, is it? It is if you're just so completely lopsided in terms of your hemispheres, or at least
if you're only do relevance realization through very specific metrics.
Right. And there's tremendous power in limiting. I mean, that's the whole movement of science. Science is, let's take all of the variables down to one. That's extremely powerful. But, and Peterson made this point years ago, once you do that, well, now, you're monofocal. That's the move. That's the power. Yeah. But you're now going to have to bring it back out into the rest of the world where there's lots of powers.
Yeah, and I think there's also, at some point, it just becomes bad science. So as an example, there's a psychiatrist that I follow who's also, he's Indian, and like he comes from an Indian family, and he also trained actually to be a Buddhist monk for several years, and he's very interesting in that sense. And he often talks about how Western medicine, one of the problems is that it does its trials in terms of human beings, and as like, this is a human being and this works on human beings,
right?
But there might be, and in Indian culture, like in Indian medicine, you have subcategories or subtypes that on whom different things work differently. And and there's a chance that it works better. I'm not familiar with that literature. It's far from my field of expertise, but at the very least, this is not even a question that would be posed. There's some sort of an assumption that if you flatten the variables, you're not going to lose anything meaningful enough for what you're trying to do. And the like a different what is it called? Something fingerprint, but like a different type of person is not something that would reveal itself in the way we do medicine now. You might have like a very astute researcher maybe knows, oh, I'm noticing a pattern here. And there's factor analysis and stuff like that, but it works on a very low scale. You can see that when you're talking about something as complex as a human a whole way of being as a person, that's not something in a way that is like scientists are going to not agree with me because I can't express it well enough exactly what I mean, because there are tools like factor analysis that are supposed to do that, but there are many ways in which if you're not looking for it, you're going to miss it in those places. Anyway, so we veered off the point of Vervaeke and
Yeah. So I think John has continued in his project. He's continued to work on the fittedness of it. And I've been watching the development of his project with respect to this. And so like when he told me, the Silk Road is, you don't live on the Silk Road. And I say, no, that's right. And the difficulty is that these legacy religions, which continue to adapt. Now we get frustrated because we want something to adapt right now. It's like, no, that's not. People don't work that way. Religions certainly don't work that way. But over long periods of time, they do.
When people do work that way, they crash and burn.
Right. And same with religions. And that's why, that's why the older the religion in some ways, the more durable it is, because it's been tested out there in the real world again and again. At the same time, there are extinct religions that were very old. So, you got to sort of give natural selection its due, that things come and go. And, the Enlightenment was a major, it was a major thing that it's continuing to reverberate throughout the world. And, in the video that I haven't released yet, I talk about, Islam and the Enlightenment. That's, because, this origin story question. And I mean, just the same reason that Genesis has been just so poured over, because it's an origin story. It's so foundational. It's so important. And, and one of the interesting things that I like to look at in religion is history of interpretation, because you watch that, okay, here's a text and it's fairly fixed. But you watch how this text has moved in different times and places, how it's moved people and how it's created things. And I mean, it's just, there's endless variables to this. None of us can live long enough to actually make much progress in any of these things. Yet at the same time, we all must choose, how shall we live? And it's an amazing thing. Well, we're coming up on 2 hours, and
2 hours,
and I've got to land the plane. But it is, Guy, it is always fun talking to you. I really love, I really love, how am I going to say this? Because I don't even know what your project is, but the fact that you are a wrestler and someone working on a PhD in cog sci, I mean, that very much fits this corner, because or at least especially this corner of the corner, because at least the audience that tends to be more around me tends to be, you know, Jonathan Peugeot more the ortho stuff, Vervaeke more the science-y stuff, a little more post-Christian stuff, but all of the wrestling of religion, which
But
tends to be have a huge span of people, but then
all of the wrestling of religion.
yes, well, you know, look at it. Jacob wrestles with God. I mean, that
Yeah.
even that word itself is a super deep word because it gets at, and of course, Plato was a wrestler, and I mean, wrestling itself. Is this all exaptation from wrestling?
I actually, that's one of the, if we're trying to think of what is it, and at its core, it's a struggle of, okay, and like it's the struggle, whatever that is for different people, different times, but it's always, it's something that's very deep in our nature. It's the brushing up against reality and, you know, all the stuff that entails. Yeah. So I do think it's not a coincidence.
No, it's not a coincidence at all. So thank you for your persistence in this, and you know, I hope that your relationship continues to develop with your fiance, and you can, you know, enjoy. You can have this level of enjoyment between you of this stuff. I have also noticed that I'm not going to get into that, but and so yeah, and I look forward to your conversations with Grizz and your conversations with Chad. And again, part of the, I mean, the corner is part of what we're wrestling with. There's the word again. Is the arenic quality of the corner and what that's affording. And again, part of the reason why you're super helpful in this is you have a degree of competence with the language, which is unusual because this is also, you know, an educational pursuit of yours. So,
yeah.
All right.
Right.
Good talking to you, guy.
Yeah.
We will see you later.
Yep.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.